This is now the color stretch, so you can see, again, the internal geometry is extremely consistent and it's a cube. I mean, what can I say? You're looking at an incredible glassine cube. Now, this is what I call the hex. We went through several stages of processing, and the hardest part of this, and the reason why most of NASA's imaging people and scientists, I think, have not seen this, is because we are dealing with glass. And before you think I have completely flipped my noodle, I'm going to quote to you a very famous NASA study, soon to become more famous, where NASA itself has decided that when it someday gets around to going back to the moon and building a lunar base, guess what they think they're going to build it from? Lunar glass. It looks as if someone may have slightly beaten them to it. Now, what you can see here is symmetry, which I literally did not see until we did this processing about 48 hours ago. Look at this. Curve, curve, indentation, indentation, out, out, in, out, 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 in, and then these lines radiating like a huge cone. Remember that tripod this thing is standing on, like this? This looks like it was some kind of operations central, because it was very elaborate, it was very protected, and what we're seeing, again, in the model of constant, incessant, meteoric bombardment, is the inner protected parts of something that must have at one time been much bigger. How much bigger than 7 miles in the sky can you get? Now, before you think that we have lost everything, when I did the UN speech a few months ago, 2 years now, just before I walked on stage, someone called the Secretary General's office and claimed that a man from Mars was speaking downstairs. I was apprehensive that someone would call the university and say that a lunatic was coming on stage here tonight. But I guess they're not. Anyway, before you think that I am a lunatic, let me talk to you about Frank Lloyd Wright. In the 1930s, Frank Lloyd Wright proposed building a mile-high skyscraper built out of concrete and steel and glass. In the 1930s, with 1930s state-of-the-art technology. Now, he was proposing doing this on planet Earth, where you have 1g, gravity, okay, where you have wind loading, thunderstorms, volcanoes, earthquakes, all kinds of vicissitudes for engineering. What could Frank Lloyd Wright have done given the airless lunar environment? No earthquakes, stable surface, no hurricanes, no wind loading, where nothing happens except the constant, incessant meteoric rain. This is going to become our mantra for tonight. Frank Lloyd Wright could easily have thrown a skyscraper 6 miles tall up into the lunar skies because gravity on the moon is 1/6 that of Earth. Well, if these guys were a little bit smarter and had access to something, a little bit tougher than concrete and steel. By the way, do you know why glass is one of the preferred materials on the moon in the NASA studies? It turns out that under airless and hydrous, that means waterless, lunar conditions, glass has the structural strength of steel. Just take away the water and the crystal defects go away, and there are some models that say that the stuff should be of the structural strength of steel. Well, if 60% of the surface of every silicate planet is silicon and oxygen, which produces quartz, which is basically sand, which is basically glass, you can see why this became the building material of choice. There's lots of raw materials. Now, are we talking about, kind of high-tech mohawks? No. We're talking about very sophisticated robotic technology, and we're talking about an energy source to process this material into endless miles of rods and beams and rebar and paneling and structural connections, and that implies hyperdimensional physics and hyperdimensional energy. In other words, if this is true, if this is in fact a real discovery of momentous proportions, artificial structures immensely old constructed by someone a long time ago on the moon, then it is in essence confirmation of the model developed through the monuments of Mars of hyperdimensional physics and energy and the use of those to process unlimited resources. In other words, if we go to the moon, if we go back to the moon, resume the space program that John Fitzgerald Kennedy envisioned over 30 years ago, the benefits to society, the ability to remake our planet by finding out how they did that, would more than make up for the trivial cost of going back, now that we know what's really there waiting for civilization. This is now 4856. Here's Bruce and Blagg. We've been looking down over here in this corner of the photo. That's where the cube hangs out. The lunar orbiter that took it was hovering right about here. Actually, it wasn't hovering. It was moving in that direction, and its sight line was here. Our sight line, as you can see, is here. So we have excellent cross-referencing, and all this weird structure is in this region. Well, it occurred to me that if we were to look north, if we were to follow along that northern track from down here where the tower appears to be, northward, we would come across the landing site of the second set of missions that we sent to the moon before Apollo, the Surveyor series. So we did. This is a post-sunset shot taken by Surveyor 6 rather, from the surface of the moon, from the surface of Sinus Medii in 1967. What's this? Remember, the moon has no air. This photograph was taken an hour after lunar sunset. NASA says that this little mark is the resume mark on the faceplate of the scanning TV system. You can faintly see the scan lines, 600 scan lines going down like that at that angle. This is supposed to be the sun's corona exposed in this 30-second time exposure. This is the geometry, by the way, that we took directly from the JPL chart. Okay, here's the sun in this diagram. Here's the corona. This is from JPL Tech Report. There's the number 321262, published in 67, I believe. Frame number 7. There were 7 photographs taken in the sequence. We've only gotten our hands on one, and again, it's through Hawaii. It was my friend Joe Gill and his trusty little camera. All right? The sun's diameter is 1/2 degree, 37 minutes of arc. Here are these weird lunar beads. Okay. The lunar beads were explained by NASA as basically sunlight being forward scattered by dust. Now, where was the dust? In their model, the dust was hovering several inches above the surface of the moon. What was holding up the dust? Electrostatic fields. This model has gone on and on and on for years. When the Apollo astronauts, particularly the Apollo 17 astronauts, landed at Taurus Littrow and did their drill cores and brought back the samples, and these were very carefully opened, and the column was examined to see how the particles would sort out. When you're panning for gold, the reason that panning works is because the heavy gold nuggets will sink to the bottom. Well, this is the inverse, where the light dust particles are supposed to float on these electrostatic fields caused by charging of sunlight at the terminator, the day-night dividing line on the moon as it goes around the moon at 20 miles an hour. What the astronauts found was there was no segregation of fine dust in the lunar core samples. The model doesn't work. So if you get rid of dust, what in the world can possibly explain this brilliant beating? This beating, by the way, is so bright that it has overexposed the Vidicon camera. It has exceeded the threshold latitude of the imaging system which took the picture. And then above it, you see this strange, well, now look closely. To begin to notice structure, begin to notice parallel lines here? Little bright things, little cubicles. Look over here, all right? Very faintly over there. Let's go forward, all right? Look at this. Parallel, 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 parallel. And then these are the scan lines coming down, but there's other lines that go vertically. Little beaten, rounded cubicles arrayed in a neat geometry. And here's the other side. Look at these. And their lighting is consistent. If the lighting is coming from the sun and is lighting up some kind of structure, some gauzy, gossamer grid that is lit only by the corona. This is not Arcturus, Antares. This is Alpha Scorpio, the brightest star in the summer sky, minus first magnitude, I believe. All right. Notice how bright, or dim, I should say, this stuff is compared to Antares. So it can't be lit by the sun direct, otherwise it would be blinding. But this is much brighter. This appears to be the inner corona, or maybe even the surface of the sun, beamed, refracted, lensed toward the camera by something right at the horizon. And then above this is this network of some kind of structure lit by the corona. And look at these parallel lines. Now it's moth-eaten, it's badly eroded, but there's enough left that you can actually see this regular spacing and this pattern of geometry, which should not, this is not in the corona. The corona doesn't have regular geometry. The corona is an expanding sphere of super hot gases at 2-3 million degrees Fahrenheit, leaving the sun at 400 to 500 miles per second. This appears to be on the moon and appears to be backlit, forward scattered light coming from some kind of grid photographed miles away by a surveyor after sunset. So this is our reconstruction of the physics of what you're seeing. Here's the photo from NASA. Here's surveyor, all right? It's looking toward the east, toward the west after sunset, okay? There's the sunset cutoff line. There's the sun shining down here 1 hour after sunset. You can actually calculate, because the moon rotates in a predictable fashion, how many degrees, how many miles, what the geometry should be. And there's a very complex geometry going on here, if we're right. The brilliant beads are caused by the ducting, the lensing along the surface by some kind of glass micro lenses into surveyor's camera. The stuff above is shielded from the corona or from the sun's surface and is lit only by the corona, which is about 1/1,000,000th as bright as the surface of the sun itself. So obviously it's going to be very, 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 very dim. If it's made of black stuff, it's going to be even dimmer, because it's going to be 1/10,000,000th if it reflects, let's say, 1%. This is what we think explains, and this is the geometry. You're sitting roughly here, looking in this direction, all right, after sunset. I'm sorry, looking over in this direction. Now, what we need to do is to look at another piece of technology, another mission, to get a comparative view. Because here was Apollo 10, whose lunar module came down to within 10 miles, and in the lunar module, out the windows, looking at the terminator between the day and night, it took 2 frames, 4789 and 4788. Now remember, this is going to be normal scattering. The sunlight coming in at a low angle, reflected up at the spacecraft, looking straight down on the dark terminator boundary. Sunlit landscape out here, lunar night down here, and this is sunrise. The sun is approaching from this direction, okay? Look what we have here. Now initially, when this was looked at, everybody thought, oh, this is just sunlight reflecting off the window of the lunar module. But as you look at the geometry, you realize, if you go in close, that that can't be true, because there's detail, there's geometry, and the focal length of the 80 millimeter lens on the Hasselblad can't have anything in focus closer than 50 feet. So how come if these are scratches on the window, how come they're in focus? I mean, if they were really scratches, you wouldn't see anything. You'd see a featureless blur. In fact, if you enhance this, you can see that there is the same kind of grid structure, and the geometry is consistent with the surface surveyor shot, which is down on the surface looking underneath portions of this over here, all right? And this is like a sun glint that is backlit, like a spider web with little tiny bits of something reflective and refractive clinging to a dark substrate, which I have called, for want of a better term, the rebar. What I think we're seeing is a dark gridwork made out of some strong material on which is suspended glass panels or glass I-beams or glass structure of some very scalable proportion. And because of this incessant, constant bombardment by meteoric rain, what you're left with after untold millions of years is basically fragments of the glass on, notice this pattern. You see there's a regular grid pattern like this? If we put this through a high-pass filter, which we've done, you really get spikes, and you can actually tell that there's a geometry there because the signal-to-noise ratio is about 5:1. This is not down in the noise. This is an easily reproducible set of observations. This is Apollo 10, frames 4789 and 4788 from orbit 32. This is back to 4856 from orbit 32, and you're looking across the surveyor site. Notice these funny things here. Originally, we thought those were hairs, that these were absolutely cruddy images. It turns out they're not. It turns out they're part of something hovering above the moon, between the spacecraft and the surface, 200 miles away, all right, because of the slant range here. And what this is, we'll show you shortly. It took us a long while to figure out the geometry. We now come to the point where I think we can answer one of the space age's most amazing mysteries. What happened to Surveyor 4? We now come to the point where I think we can answer one of the space age's most amazing mysteries. What happened to Surveyor 4? You'll notice here in the center of the moon, and on the right and on the left, there are a series of little dots. These dots represent landing sites of projected and actual missions. The Ranger crash landing spacecraft, the Russian soft landers and crash landers, the Surveyor landers, and of course the Apollo program itself. Clustered in the center, the only space where there were two spacecraft designated to land, and this is how the spacecraft landed. Surveyor took 3 days to come out from Earth. It coasted most of the way after liftoff. It then turned around, it fired a retro rocket, and ultimately landed softly on these three little landing legs on liquid fuel vernier rockets from propellant stored on board in tanks. The retro rocket, the solid fuel retro rocket, would drop away at roughly 40,000 feet altitude. That's 8 miles at a burnout after the retro rocket had burned out. In 1967, in the middle of July of 1967, Surveyor 4 was targeted to land very close to the edge of Sinus Medi. Oort is up here, the tower is down here. The Surveyor structures that we've seen in that sunset shot are arrayed along here. And the terminator photography that Apollo conducted is located right around in here. All right, so it's all clustered in this little tiny area. Before all of this, in the middle of July, on the 16th of July, Surveyor 4 was to touch down, first soft landing in Sinus Medi on the moon. Why Sinus Medi? Because that was one of the Apollo landing sites that NASA was looking at. In fact, it turned out to be site selection number 3. Okay. A few seconds before it was to land, Surveyor 4 totally disappeared. In Aviation Week in Space Technology, which is the Bible of the aerospace industry, this little story appeared. It says, abrupt loss of all communications 2 seconds before burnout. That would put it at about 40,000 feet. No indication of trouble was received up to the last moment. It had been an absolutely perfect mission. Nothing had gone wrong. One of the curious things which has stuck in my memory, remember I was back in the museum, actually I was back in high school, traipsing back and forth to the museums during this period of time, was the instantaneous nature of the cutoff and the absence of any signal attenuation. NASA and the government and the DoD and whatever have had a lot of failures of spacecraft over the years. A lot of times, you've seen these old photographs where an Atlas rocket takes off and it rises up and then it begins to slowly and majestically do something which is the horror of every engineer. It begins to turn somersaults. It's not supposed to do that. And when it turns somersaults, the structural forces and whatever rip out paneling and separate tanks, and suddenly you get this blinding explosion. On the radios, on the telemetry link, the engineers can see the spacecraft die. The reason is simple. The speed of electrons and the speed of light are a lot faster than the speed of a chemical explosion. So as shrapnel is ripping the guts out of this exquisite jewel of handcrafted engineering, causing every engineer to weep with horror at his or her handiwork going up in flames, the telemetry people are watching the process of death on the oscilloscopes and on the chart recorders and whatever, because you can see it actually die. The shrapnel going through the radio cannot go fast enough before the echo, the attenuation, makes itself known. And it's from these readouts that engineers can reconstruct many times, provided they don't turn off the radio before things happen. They can that's an inside joke. You can reconstruct how the spacecraft died. That's why, by the way, you never turn off the radio. That's the second mantra. Well, Surveyor 4 didn't do any of that. 1 microsecond, Surveyor 4 was there. And the next microsecond, Surveyor 4 was not. And no one to this day has provided an explanation for what happened. Even the engineers at the time basically ruled out an explosion because they didn't see it, and they should have seen an explosion as it was destroying itself. The telemetry should have given them some indication from the instruments scattered around the spacecraft of a shock wave, a pressure wave, whatever. Instead, well, let me tell you what happened. And we don't need to move this slide because I'll tell you what's up there. This is the logo of Craig Wanke, who was one of our Mars mission members in California, who has been functioning as one of our intelligence agents on this little project. What Mark did was to, at my request, write to JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and asked in a very nice way, with nice officialese, whatever happened to Surveyor 4? Could they please provide engineering data to fill in the historical gap caused by the absence of this spacecraft in all discernible records, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Before I show you what he got back as a reply, let me show you a couple of other letters that have been received from NASA and other agencies. This is a letter from a Mr. Hill, I believe, who is a proponent of the hollow Earth theory, namely that there are aliens living in the Earth and they're doing weird things and they're controlling the secret government. All right? Mr. Hill wrote to this particular gentleman at NASA, who is a reasonably high official, and received a very courteous response. Mr. Hill is very prolific, and he even wrote to the White House. You can't see it behind the video projector there, but he got a letter from D.D. Myers saying that Bill Clinton was very interested in Mr. Hill's thoughts about the hollow earth and the secret government. Not only that, but this is the second letter that the White House sent to Mr. Hill, acknowledging that they had already received the first and that Mr. Clinton thinks that Americans should be well noted for their ideas. This is the letter that Craig Warnke got back from JPL. Now, what you see is his own letter. You see the JPL envelope, and at the bottom, highlighted in yellow, is the official NASA JPL response to Craig's request for information on Surveyor 4. The mission failed. Communication was lost during a retrorocket burn, period. Now, having dealt with a government that is first on the planet in the destruction of trees to generate letters on every conceivable subject, don't you find it a tad curious that JPL sent Craig's own letter back to him with a scribbled note and no address, no signature, no person, no nothing? NASA does not even have a record that this letter ever came to JPL. There's nothing in the file. No one will ever be able to find out that Craig Warnke on such and such a date wrote requesting information on Surveyor 4. Is it possible that someone is a tad sensitive about what happened to Surveyor 4? Would you like to know my theory as to what happened to Surveyor 4? You can see it right up there. At 6,000 miles per hour, it went splat. Backing down on the retro rocket, NASA had no idea that there was a grid, a structure, a tower, a mechanical object, a physical thing. And just before burnout, this poor little robot, without a clue, without radar to tell it what was coming up, it suddenly hit a wall. And what happens if you mechanically change the antenna by mechanically hitting it, you will change the beam pattern faster than the speed of light. It's called the scissors effect. Imagine an infinitely long scissors, and I close this end. The tips at some point on the scissors, the lateral swing will exceed the speed of light in the thought experiment. When I take the laser and I move it around the room, the tip is exceeding, the beam over there is exceeding the speed of light. Well, maybe not over there, but somewhere out there. The fact is that this spacecraft, I now believe, hit whatever larger structure this used to be part of. And when you look at the maps, when you actually reconstruct how it was coming in, it turns out that the flight path was very close to where we now think the tower exists. And when you inquire about Surveyor 4, you get your own letter back, the ultimate in recycling, with a handwritten note, with very terse, non-bureaucratic ease: the mission failed. Don't ask any more questions. So what's this? This is what I think Surveyor 4 ran into. I think there is, or was, a dome over Sinus Medii. And I think what we're seeing are fragments of the edge of this vast, multi-leveled, highly complex dome, which on Earth we already can see examples of. It's called the biosphere. And in the biosphere, what they have done is to take a trusswork made out of steel and hung glass panels and created a synthetic inside world, cut off, segregated, separated from the outside environment. Magnify this by 10, 15, 20 times. Not much for someone that knows a little bit more about engineering than we in the latter part of the 20th century do. And that's what I think Surveyor 4 had the misfortune of running into on the moon. And here, in another part of 4856, is the edges of the dome. This is now a very nicely enhanced sectional of Apollo frame 4856. Look at the cubical spacing, look at the multiple tier geometry, look at how it goes off beyond the terminator. You know, we're back to the golden arches. This is below the cube, which is way up here. How in the world has NASA been able to keep from telling us all these years? The answer to that is probably going to be the substance of many, many interesting congressional investigations. This is a joint session of the U.S. House of Representatives and the United States Senate. The date is May 25th, 1961. This is the President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, laying out the vision of going to the moon. Here's what he said.
Time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
7 years, little over 7 years from the time that John Kennedy ushered in the space age with those words, astronauts were leaving regularly aboard the Saturn V, departing for, entering into, and looking down from lunar orbit. It is inconceivable to me that astronauts could not have seen some of what we've seen. And what we have been doing, in part, as this research has unfolded, is to go back to the original transcripts and try to figure out from the air to ground what it was that they may have said that would give us a clue. Because some of this stuff, if you look out the window with a monocular or a binocular, you should have seen, beginning with Apollo 8.
Stanford, go for TLA. Apollo 8 coming up on 20 seconds to ignition. Mark it, and you're looking very good. Roger.
Transmission is coming to you approximately halfway between the moon and the Earth. We've had 31 hours, about 20 minutes into flight. We have about less than 40 hours left to go to the moon.
Apollo 8 Houston, 1 minute to LOS, all systems go. All right, as you're going, command reset, tape recorder forward, low bit rate. Roger, safe journey, guys.
We've got it. Apollo 8 now in lunar orbit.
It's now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness.
Christmas, December 1968. For me, this is kind of poignant because that was my first mission with Walter Cronkite. That was my inaugural flight with CBS News. And I thought I knew the moon then. I thought I had lived every moment of history in the making. And I was wrong. The reason I was wrong is because something in the mechanism that was supposed to transmit the real information from the missions to the American people broke down. And it is up to us now to retrieve whatever that missing piece was, fix it, and go on as we were supposed to. A couple weeks ago, when Jackie Kennedy died, I was watching CNN putting this presentation together, thinking of this night. And I noticed that her biographer had a very interesting comment. She said that Jacqueline was only interested during the Kennedy years, during Camelot, in two political processes. One was the Alliance for Progress in South America, and the other was the space program. And I couldn't help but think of Queen Isabella and what had prompted John Kennedy to issue this challenge. We have all thought that it was Lyndon Johnson, who was the big-hearted, expansive Texan who galvanized us to go to the moon, beat the Russians, et cetera, et cetera. Is it possible that maybe we have someone else to thank for having this data? I don't have the answer, but I'm going to try to find out because I think it's important. Because what this will allow us to do is to return the process to the people that was begun by the Kennedy vision over 30 years ago, if we are correct. This now is a lunar orbiter frame. If you look to the north, you can see from the lunar orbiter position that 85M, 84M is this one, which has the tower and the shard down here. 85M, taken a few seconds later, looks to the northwest, all right? And what you see, if you look to the northwest, is this picture. This is 85M. Oort is up here, all right? Remember, this all started by looking at the triangle in Oort. Here is Caladni, just out of frame here. Here's a row of hills. Here's another hill, and there's some pounded, meteoric, battered debris in the center. Nothing to get anybody interested in this picture whatsoever. It's like a million other frames of the moon, right? Let's look again. You can see the outline of the wide angle, the M, and nested inside in these little red lines are the H's. There are 3 H photographs, 8 times the resolution of the wide angle M. There's Oort up there, there's Tri-Snecker. These are view angles, all right? Forget those lines for a minute, we'll get back to them. This now is a close-up showing the close-ups that are nested inside the wide angle in green. And as we look at one of them, you can see now the close-up of this little hill in the front, and lying out across in front of the camera as a wedge, you see this battered landscape, and there are craters and craters and craters, and again, nothing to write home about unless you begin to look really carefully. And then, if you're really sharp, you'll begin to notice that the craters are not single, they're double. And they're all aligned. Now, to make it easier, we can move in, all right? Here they are. Double, 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 double. There's a nice double one, all right? What causes double craters? Are we skipping stones off the surface so it goes boing, boing? And again, if we're dealing with boing, why aren't we getting boings at all angles? Why are they all aligned? Let's move in. The more you move in, the more you see these little double things tend to occur in pairs. They tend to be above and below each other. As you get closer and closer, you can see, as you begin to look at the structure, that instead of being a scooped out hole in a solid substrate, they have a microstructure. You can see here's one and here's another. In fact, there's an ellipse that runs around both with a kind of a dividing line in between. All right? It's almost as if, okay, here, let's get closer, all right? Now notice the shards, notice the layering, notice the vertical spacing. There is an intense geometry about these that defies conventional lunar explanation. The smallest things you're seeing on the scale of these photographs, now there's a real good one, all right? And they're all aligned. They're tilted about 40 degrees off the north-south line. Row after row after row after row after row. And because, I'm going to leap to the end of this, we're dealing with a glass material, you're looking through levels and layers. Here's one end, and here's the other end. Double. And they have structure that goes down in between, and you can actually see what look to be like walls. Now look at this thing up here, all right? Hanging. And before you say that's a hair, this is an Earth photograph by way of comparison. The problem with looking at ruins is unless you're good at geometry and know how to abstract and look at the geometric underlying pattern, not looking for the Chrysler Building, you're not going to see the obvious. This is Dresden after the horrible firebombing in World War II. This is a close-up of Dresden, all right? This is a close-up of one of these stringers. Notice the similar pattern. Notice the verticals, the horizontals, the crossbar, the regular size of each of these little vesicles, whatever they are. There's a wall sticking out. Notice this parallel pattern. Notice this one above it. Notice this. You're looking at a 3D cross-section of three basic geometries, a hexagonal 3D geometry as near as we can dope it out. Robert Feartek, one of our architects, and I have been trying to figure out now for several months the 3D pattern. Look at this little thing up here. This is another little tiny shard, and this is fairly small. This is probably on the order of 20, 30 feet tall, given that the best resolution on this picture, and these are the ruins again, on Earth. Compare this with this, all right? Again, notice the pattern. Look for the mega pattern, all right? Don't try to recognize a specific building. Look at the regular geometry of the pattern. The most amazing regular geometry is when you have edges, bright edges, refracting sunlight, which have absolutely precise geometric patterns like this. And look at here. You can see how it's made of transparent material. So you have edges hanging in front of other edges. And you can see, I mean, it's no wonder that most of the agency completely overlooked this, because this boggles the mind. This transcends the belief of anybody dealing with lunar geology, lunar structure. They're looking for volcanoes and, craters and secondaries and, marginal mare emplacements and wrinkle ridges. They're not looking for shards of glass. This is the moon they think exists. This is the moon that has to exist. So under this kind of bombardment, again, the standard model, how can you have anything like that? Look at how delicate, look at how fragile. This is crystal. This is a crystalline material which has shards. This is on the order of a reasonable building on Earth, except it's hanging, obviously, over mid-space, over a chasm of some kind, created by a major impact. What we know about the moon is that the moon is composed of an Earth side and a far side, and the two sides are not the same. There definitely appears to be a side that we can see that is plain, mottled, dark, with interleaved terrain. These are geological maps made by taking multispectral data and superimposing it over the normal photographs. The highlands, the bright material on the Earth side, accounts for maybe 30, 40%. On the far side, it accounts for 80, 90%. There appears to be a real disparity between the side we can see and the side we can't see. What is the reason for that disparity? That is a question which has been lingering for age after age after age in the minds of everyone. Well, we're on the verge of getting an answer. The Apollo missions and the rocks they brought back, we now believe will furnish us the chemical clues to begin to come up with an answer. And it turns out that that answer is in the form of data from the Apollo 8 mission. The Apollo 8 mission, as I said before, flew to the moon in December of 1968, made 10 orbits and came home. The most amazing Christmas present the world has seen then and has seen since. One of the benefits of talking about this presentation has been that as I've been on the radio coast to coast a couple, 3 nights ago, one of the former NASA employees that heard me put this catalog, an original Apollo 8 catalog, in the Federal Express system and got it to me within 24 hours so I could look through it. There's an SP number up there, which I think is 207, so you can go back and get it yourself if you can find one somewhere in the world. The reason it's important is because it contains all of the background data on the films and lenses and technology whereby these photographs were acquired. Table after table of reciprocity of the film, the focal length of the lenses, shutter speeds, light reflectance, transmission in infrared, visible, ultraviolet. And then in the back it contains photograph after photograph taken during the Apollo 8 mission. It is a treasure trove. It's about that thick. It's everything you ever wanted to know about Apollo 8 and didn't know who to ask. It has become a benchmark, and I'll show you why. For other missions, for like this, Apollo 12, remember Surveyor 3 that landed over in Oceanus Procellarum, visited by Apollo 12? Well, this is the cover photograph of a report on the analysis of the Surveyor material returned to Earth. Unlike Surveyor 4, when you inquire about this Surveyor spacecraft, you get decent data for some reason. And inside, in the back, there are photographs, photograph after photograph, very nicely portrayed with the frame number. So if you want this photograph, you can order that frame number and you'll get it. Craig Wantke, who has become our kind of lunar resource in terms of early warning data, told me months ago, a year and a half ago when I began this, he says, Dick, he says, I have the original Apollo 10 catalog. And so I had him send to me samples of what was in the catalog. And this is what I got. Here we have a photograph, blank. Here's one overexposed. This is dark. This is way underexposed. This is dark, overexposed, way underexposed, blank, underexposed, underexposed, well, this one's all right. Out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1 out of 12. And that's only one page. This goes on for page after page after page. Now, do you mean to tell me between 1969, when Apollo 8 came out with its catalog, and 1971, when the Apollo 10 catalog was issued, that catalog production technology in the United States took a terrible drop? That somehow NASA had the wrong contractor? That people were basically hiring ghost employees? I mean, no one would ever do that in the federal government, would they? You're up on it, okay. So what we did is, I'm always intrigued by the weird stuff. Thank you. Show me an anomaly, and I wonder what's behind the anomaly. It's like I should have been Monty Hall. I'll take door number 3. Well, this really intrigued me. So what did I do? I ordered the blank photograph. And guess what? There it is. Now, this is kind of interesting. If you look on this map, you will see every photograph taken by Apollo 10 of the Okhurt region, okay? Well, almost. You won't see this one. It's blank in the photo section. It doesn't appear on the maps, and yet there it is. Now, how did we acquire a non-existent picture? Well, in the wake of Mars Observer, there are people who are sending us data. Now, this is 4822. This is perhaps the most important photo that I'm going to talk to you about tonight. So mark that down. Okay, this is, Okhurt is over on the left here. There's an interesting series of linear features. They're very large. We're talking 10, 20, 30 miles along here, okay? This is a very large amount of terrain. Over here if you look carefully, you'll begin to see a kind of a regular pattern. This is the part that Dr. Cornett calls Los Angeles, because it turns out to have a grid-like pattern. Dr. Cornett is a geologist. He is from Red Bank, New Jersey. He was with Lamont Doherty, Columbia University. And when I showed him this stuff as a geologist, can I say freaked out? Can I say that, Bruce? This really bothers him because this should not be on the moon. This is as if you were looking at Hiroshima or Nagasaki after the war. The streets are there, the foundations are there, the buildings are gone, but the pattern remains. Now, let's look a little more closely. This is a very interesting photo. For one thing, the light fall off as you go from here over to here is really, really weird. Remember, there's an airless vacuum. What in the world would cause the fall off from here to here? The phase angle is about 30 degrees, all right? The sun is coming in from the right. It's about normal lighting. So why should the photo get really dark over there? Well, let's look closer, all right? Now we've got this stuff again, and let's look really close. And this, of course, I think is why they don't want you to see this, because this now, look at all these faint lines. Look at how they're oriented, parallel. They're not caused by photo developing. This is the hyginous rill back here. Look at how dark the surface becomes. Look at how this stuff is uniformly scattered, except it's got a coherence. And then look at this little guy. And as we zoom in, you'll see why this photograph is blanked out in the catalog. This is a castle floating 30 miles above the moon. Now, it's not a real castle, but it certainly looks like a castle. It looks like that one in Germany that they patterned, Sleeping Beauty's castle in Disney after. This is an absolutely stunning object. This should not exist. As one of our geologists said, hell, he says, Dick, when they looked out the windows, they should have been able to see the pigeons on that one as it went by. If you look at this carefully, and we've done a preliminary analysis because we literally just found this, all right? You can see that every part of the lighting is consistent with the sun coming in, a 3D glass crystalline structure, a remnant hanging on the rebar, the invisible dark substrate of the dome over Sinus Medii. And if you look really closely, notice how it's glowing. Notice how proportioned, how the shadows are falling correctly. When our photographic expert, Carrie Clark, at High Definition Image in New York, looked at this, she absolutely freaked out. Her first reaction was that can't be real, and she actually looked at the print. Now let me tell you how I got this. This came as part of a set of 16 by 20 prints by way of one of my NASA contacts at Greenbelt, Maryland. We do not have the negative. When we ordered the negative, this and all its companions have vanished. However, we found other things which demonstrate to us that this is real. In fact, what I'm going to be able to show you is there's more than one 4822, and I can prove it here tonight. Okay, this is now the best close-up. Notice that these things appear to be, what do they call this, trapezoidal, okay? And there's a consistency again in the lighting. This is conical. There's a little dome here, all right? This is absolutely amazing to exist. Look at that. Believe me, when I saw this, I said there is no way that the astronauts could not have seen this. So how have we been fed, given the lie that nothing unusual was seen orbiting over the moon? Look, this part down here, if you look very carefully, you can see there's a faint white line that runs and connects these two, all right? This is a fragment like this, except most of the rest of this has been blown away by meteorite activity. This thing has, there's no way to judge how big it is because we don't know how far away it is. What we do know is that it's part of a contiguous set of objects hung in a 3D matrix. Look at this one. Now this looks like a close-up of some of the rebar we saw on the southern part of Sinus Medi. This one is this guy up here. All right, what I want to show you here is if you look very carefully, you can see it's lit by sunlight here. Sun is coming in this way. There's the shadows. Then it disappears for a while, and it comes back out because there is an obscuring medium between the camera and the object. This stuff is in planes and in layering and in 3D, and you're looking edgewise through, I believe, the curving upper parts of this dome. Now, I'm calling it a dome. In fact, I think it's a hexagonal truss. I don't think it looks like a dome in the sense of being a smooth, polished dome. I think it was built of a complex geometry. And what did Bucky Fuller finally show us? That a truss work, a trapezoidal, tetrahedral geometry, hexagonal geometry is the strongest pound for pound of anything you can build. Okay. Now, look at this one. You see the individual indentations? The important thing is that this does not live by itself. If you only had one object, you would say there's no way that it can be real. But the fact that you have consistent lighting, that you have surrounding objects also lit with consistent lighting, and there is material linking these objects in a matrix, that's what gives us confidence that this, in fact, is part of fragmentary debris, the bits clinging to the spider web, to the grid, to the rebar of the former pristine structure. And the only logical reason for something being this high is either a dome or spires sticking up out of a dome. Now here again we have a highly notice these faint radial lines. This is very important. If we can get one other frame where we can pull this stuff up, we can do stereo and actually get the distance to these things. But unless we put a concerted political effort, I mean, I think we got this frame by accident. I don't think this was intended for us to get, because when we, went in to get negatives, we found some very strange fishiness, like this, all right? This is now an overexposed version of 4822, all right? Here's our little castle. This is a crater called Menelaus back toward the horizon, all right? Maybe, well, you're about 500 miles away because you're twice the altitude and the hypotenuse is longer, all right? Here's Ukert over here. Notice there's stuff in the sky, all right? Now, this is close-up Menelaus. Now this is enhanced looking toward Menelaus. Look at all this stuff lying above the sight line. Look at how it gets denser as you go down and thins out as you go up. And notice again that there is an internal consistency to the geometry, and there are parallel lines cross-bracing. See that one there? All right, now focus on this up here, all right? This is, I think, the apex of the dome. You see this here? This is a photographic defect, all right? That's not real, all right? But this is, and notice this. Notice this truss. It almost looks like a bridge beam, all right? You see this coherence with all these little bits and pieces scattered around it? This, I think, is the uppermost part of the dome, and we found another one of these in much better condition about a third of the way around the planet. This, of course, is Biosphere 2. This, Biosphere 1? I mean, this is a lot older than this, but the model is the same. I mean, look, the purpose of these guys' experiment, funded by Mr. Bass out there in the Arizona desert, is to explore the possibility that someday we will take men and women and we will go where you will need completely contained environments. Paulo Soleri called them arcologies, architectural ecologies. Well, here we seem to have an example that somebody's beat us to it. Now that, of course, is mind-boggling enough, but the correlative mind-boggling thing is that the geometry of the grid turns out to be the same. Remember, common engineering, common solution to common problems. You simply scale this up by some factor and you've got yourself what we're seeing on this lunar data, except it should not exist above the moon. Now, here's another weirdness. This really bothers us at a political level because this is 4822. All right, look very carefully. Look at this little guy right over here and look over here. All right, there's Menelaus, there's our castle. All right, there's the photo degradation, the strange light effect that goes down. Let me give you a possible explanation for that weird effect. If the grid is acting like Venetian blinds, you've got physical members all in parallel. Over here, you're looking through the blinds, the rebar, at an angle that allows light to penetrate up. Over here, you change that angle by almost 35 degrees, and what happens? It gets darker and darker and darker because it's like closing a Lunar blind. It's a mechanical shutter effect. Nothing like this should really be on the lunar surface unless there's something obscuring your view, which is created by a geometric effect caused by a mechanical blockage of the light reaching you from the surface to the camera. And again, this is a testable model. All right, now what is wrong with this picture? This is one produced, this is 4822 from the National Space Science Data Center. For one thing, this guy is missing. They're all missing. And for another thing, if you look really closely down here, you'll see that there's a change. A brilliant specular reflection, which is not present on our original 4822. Now, how did that get there? I mean, you can't have a picture changing itself between the copying process. If they airbrushed out the other stuff and gave us merely a photo without the good stuff on it, how did that appear? Answer: you're looking at a specular reflection. This now is part of this complex. This is now in close-up. Look at this. Yeah, look at this. Now, notice the pattern. Notice this grid pattern, all right? This whole thing is a glass structure on the surface of the moon on the scale of a mountain. You are looking at a fragment of a destroyed arcology at the edge of Sinus Medi, just to the west of Okhurt. And remember, the reason we're looking in this region is because from 250,000 miles away in the center of the lunar disk, in the middle of that crater, there is an eerie equilateral triangle that should not be there. Indiana Jones was right. X does not mark the spot. Now, as you look carefully, you'll see that this brilliant reflection has, again, geometry. This has got to be a planar surface of very large dimensions, which as the moon rotated and the spacecraft was moving, the angles all got just right, and you had this sudden piercing reflection. Now let me show you the geometry, because this is very important to decoding. Oh, this, by the way, is another 4822. All right? Where's the reflection? This was our second order from the National Space Science Data Center. We've been keeping very careful records. We've been getting photographs from Houston. We've been getting photographs from NSDC. We've gotten some from Hawaii, a couple from private archives. We had one filched from the administrator's office in Washington and NASA headquarters. I'm not going to tell you who did that. And what's interesting is the same frame numbers, things keep changing. Now that shouldn't be happening. Again, look at this pattern. If you look carefully, you'll see that the pattern remains the same, all right, in terms of the megastructure, but in terms of that reflection, look, by the way, at what's going on up there in that weird little thing. I call that, by the way, the Crystal Palace, because it literally is hanging in midair, another mini version of the other guy, but this one is much closer. This one is only a mile above the surface. All right, this is now back to the reflection shot. Look at this. Look at this geometry. This is a whole apartment complex. See the layering? Now, when you photograph different angles of a surface, you should get the same surface if the angle changes a degree or two. And as the astronauts are moving at about 1.5 miles per second, you know, depending upon the interval of picture, pause, picture, the angle should not change all that much. But what's happening here is the surface is changing wildly. The reason has to do with the nature of optics, the nature of physics, the fact that as you're moving, this now is a false color and you can really see the planes and the multiple geometries of the reflection in front of the Crystal Palace. This thing is a 3D glass structure and you're looking deep into it through not only what's ever between you and the spacecraft, but also between what is ever between the surface and deep inside. And the detailed photometric is going to blow us away when we get the numbers. This now is back to one of our 4822s. Look at these regular. Look at it as regular. All right, there's a huge cavity in here. You can see stuff way down. This is enormous. This thing is a good 10, 15 miles. All right, with absolute regular crystalline geometry battered to hell by billions of years of incessant meteoric rain. Now look at this detailed structure. Look at these shards. How can these shards have persisted under any process, under this constant bombardment, unless, and this is crucial, if you begin with a fragile crystalline structure and you begin to erode it, Bruce will attest, my resident geologist here, one of several, that the structure will erode back along the previous structure. In other words, a hexagonal lattice-like structure will retain its hexagonal lattice-like structure. It just will get smaller and smaller and smaller. It's like a sugar cube melting in water. And finally, this is now close-up of the Crystal Palace, the shard sticking up in front of it. Look at the planes. Look at the geometry. They're going to say on my tombstone, he died for geometry. This is a dome. This is part of a dome. You can see the translucence and then this stuff embedded inside, beaten to hell. This is now the details of the glass shards. Look at this stuff. This is not the moon we have been given for over 30 years. This is something else, and this frame doesn't even show on this portrayal of frames. Now this is the reflection geometry. Here's the sun, and you get a cone of light from a planar surface. If the same size cone is farther back, it takes you longer to go through it. What we can do is to look at these photographs and watch the reflections popping in and out in the overall picture. And this stuff is filled with glass-like specular reflections. What do we do about this, and how do we get our space program back? As you can see, the Clementine mission is a very mysterious mission. It was launched into lunar orbit in January of this year, literally on the evening of the President's State of the Union address on January 25th. It took a month to get to the moon. They placed it in polar orbit. Mission run by the Pentagon, by the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization, spent 2 months mapping the moon at resolution down to, we are told, something on the order of 100 meters, that's 300 feet. At that scale, unless you know what you're looking for and looking at, you're not going to see the things that I've been showing you tonight. The photographs that I've been showing are on the order of resolution of 10 meters down to 1 meter for the close-ups looking over Kurt from 85M on the high resolution. This is a Clementine photograph of the North Polar region. It was taken from 1,500 miles away. When I asked some of the Clementine folks why they were not going down to lunar orbit altitude, they told me they could not because of orbit instabilities. Now, that's not the reason. But given what we have just seen, given the fact that there are debris clouds hanging, suspended, and visible at some lighting in the skies above the lunar surface, what else could they say? We can't go any lower, Dick, because we'll get clobbered? That would kind of give the game away. I mean, I am amazed that we did not kill one group of the Apollo astronauts. Looking back now, looking at how close this stuff is, how much of it there is, I could go on for hours with the data we've acquired, and we will in other forums. But what we have found is, for instance, transcripts where the astronauts literally report that they have seen veilings and gauzy material overlying the lunar surface, and they make comments like, it looks as if it's suspended above it, but of course that can't be. And in other references, other papers where they were looking at dim light phenomena before dawn and after sunset, they report just before sunrise incredible, bright, very parallel geometric rays of light extending up from the horizon above the spacecraft. That means in some sections, this rebar, this grid, has to extend above the orbit of the Apollo spacecraft. And it's only because it's got lots and lots of holes, and these photographs are looking through literally tens of thousands of cubic miles and making it appear as if it's very dense, that we're able to see some of this stuff at all, because if it's a day, it's very, very old and almost gone. Now, Clementine is important because during the 2-month Clementine mission, as opposed to Lunar Orbiter, which took film, as opposed to Surveyor, which sat at one spot on the surface and took TV, as opposed to Apollo that took handheld photographs, Clementine returned 1.5 million electronic, state-of-the-art CCD images of the moon in every spectral band from ultraviolet to infrared. Unfortunately, those photographs do not come under the NASA charter. Unfortunately, if they so chose, they could keep every single frame from us. We are now told that we are not going to get to see these images until late fall or maybe by Christmas. If that's true, can you imagine what you could do with a supercomputer working on these frames day and night to gently remove any of the offending material, so we preserve the illusion that the moon that Clementine saw is the same moon that Apollo saw, is the same moon that Surveyor saw, is the same moon that Galileo saw. We must ask, demand, through the constitutional, legislative, congressional process, and through the administration, through members of the Clinton administration to whom we are going to show this, we must demand immediate full access to all of the Clementine imagery. That's the first thing. Around Clementine, there is something of a problem, because when Clementine finished orbiting the moon, one of the things that the Pentagon tried to do, even though the mission had been dubbed as a moon asteroid mission, was they attempted to kill the mission financially. The day the spacecraft left orbit, the head of BMDO, General O'Neill, tried to close down the Clementine operation for want of $3.2 million. Senators and congressmen came to the rescue, and on Wednesday morning, the New York Times reported that the money had been reprogrammed from some other project, and in fact, they had put it back in, and the mission was going to go on, leave lunar orbit. It was going to successfully loop around the Earth once, and then back out within 7,800 miles of the moon and on to a rendezvous with Geographos in August of this year. Then, a couple days later, this AP story appeared. On Saturday morning, Saturday is a bad day for spacecraft. Mars Observer disappeared on a Saturday. On Saturday morning, 3 or 4 days after O'Neill had tried to kill Clementine financially and was forced to rescind the order by Congress, the onboard computer mistakenly activated several thrusters, burning up much of the fuel and basically killing the mission. The spacecraft is now a useless piece of junk spinning at 80 RPM between Earth and the moon. Now, all of this would not be relevant except without those photographs, we are not going to be able to find out what it was that Clementine verified of our hypothesis. And If there is any doubt in your minds now that something is going on, that something is being withheld, I would like to refer you back to how we began this presentation, which is the Brookings document. Because on page 216, it says, continuing studies are recommended to determine emotional and intellectual understanding and attitude and successive alterations of them, if any, regarding the possibility and consequences of discovering intelligent extraterrestrial life. To which my question is, were those studies ever conducted? And if they were, what did they find? Did they find that we would freak out, that we would keel over, that we will disintegrate if we were to find officially that all of this was correct? But the capper for the Brookings document, which is my reason for apprehension about what's going to happen to the NASA archives, as well as the Clementine imagery, is in this page when it goes on to say that questions one might wish to answer by such studies should include how might such information, under what circumstances, be presented to or withheld from the public? For what ends? And then one might the role of the discovering scientists and other decision makers regarding release of the fact of discovery. This again is a document commissioned by NASA in the late 50s, early 60s on what to do if and when material, information such as I presented tonight were to become available to our scientific process. In the footnotes to Brookings, it says the fundamentalist and anti-science sects are growing apace around the world. Remember, this is 59. And as missionary enterprises may have schools and a good deal of literature attached to them. One of the important things is that where they are active, they appeal to the illiterate and semi-illiterate, including as missions the preachers as well as the congregation, and can pile up very influential followings in terms of numbers. For them, the discovery of other life, rather than any other space product, would be electrifying. So there you have it. In 1959, fear of religious fanaticism as a reason for withholding knowledge that the human race is not alone. Now, the world that Brookings forecast 30 years ago is the world we now inhabit in 1994. What are the major terrorists and trouble spots on Earth fueled by? What is Bosnia being shattered in front of our television screens every night by? What almost shattered the World Trade Towers in New York? Religious, fanatical fundamentalism. Is that the reason why NASA for 30 years has dared not tell us what it found right next door? And finally, there is perhaps the ironic capper that the document says that it is perhaps interesting to note that of all the groups, it said that scientists and engineers might be the most devastated by the discovery of relatively superior creatures. And who, might we ask, has been running NASA for the last 30 years, but scientists and engineers? Ladies and gentlemen, I put it to you very simply that all we can do is to pray that out of the millions of pictures acquired by NASA and the thousands that were distributed freely in the early days and years when it was honest, some people have retained in their personal and library and museum archives copies and samples and duplicates of that which I've shown you tonight. And it is incumbent, it is mandated, it is demanded that we go to those people and find those frames and duplicate what we have done and find out why we have been lied to all these years. This is the Apollo mapping camera. The latter Apollos from Apollo 15 through 17 carried a 24-inch camera that took photographs from horizon to horizon and then very high-resolution strips of photography all the way around the moon. Almost none of that photography has been examined. The photographs and the catalogs literally live 1,000 miles apart. The people who have the catalogs don't ever see the frames. The people who have the frames can never see the catalogs. That's interesting. What we're now going to do as the next phase of this investigation is to begin to systematically go through those mapping camera archives and find additional corroborating geometries of the objects we've discovered. We have many more. We've not had time tonight to show you more than a third of what we have accumulated in the last year and a half, but I think I've shown you enough to raise profound questions about the honesty and the efficacy of what some, not all, but some in our space agency have been doing under the guise of consonance with the NASA Charter. Something absolutely has to be changed. Let me end with the piece of video, the final piece of video, all right? Because I want to give you a kind of historical legacy and show you why it is absolutely crucial that we figure this out. This is, of course, a photograph, another Galileo montage taken by the successful Galileo swing-by in 1991 en route to Jupiter of the spacecraft photographing Earth from several million miles away. While this photograph was being taken, down on Earth, normal things were occurring. Sunrise, moonrise, dawn, the Earth spinning from night into day as it has been doing for thousands, millions, billions of years. And in a small place in England, Salisbury Plain, a stone monument exists that sees another dawn, like countless dawns before, huge rocks piled up in an enigmatic circle with a semicircle inside. It is this object which people like Jerry Hawkins and others have now proven was a monument to Selene, a monument to mark the passage and the timing of the moon between the standing stones. It is, of course, modern science which allows us to look deeper at this monument, and one of our team, Carl Monk, has discovered that some of the math and geometry that we have discovered at Cydonia also appears in the layout of this structure located on the Salisbury Plain in England. The specific geometry repeats in the standing stones, in the layout, in the dimensions, in the radius, in the very form of the monument itself. 1,000 years ahead in time, as this planet has been spinning around the sun and spinning on its axis, a whole new generation of moon watchers has arisen. Generation of moon watchers who can build cities, lay out carpets of steel and glass and lighting, travel freely from continent to continent, and briefly fling small slivers of technology 250,000 miles away into space to travel between Earth and Moon. That culture now stands poised between a past which, if the monuments of the Moon are as interesting as the monuments of Mars, must stretch now billions of years backward into time. It also stands in front of a future which could be unimaginably rich, a future which could be unimaginably interesting and bright if we only do what we have to do now and ask the right questions and go back to the moon and look with uncensored eyes. And if we do, we will find wonders and treasures beyond imagining. It is up to us. Thank you.